Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Kevin Green, he's the public sector CTO at OpenText, and David Dalling. He is the vice president of cyber strategy at Splunk. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us today. And we're going to talk about cybersecurity, which is an ever-changing but always popular topic because there's always cybersecurity problems. And maybe let's start with your view, it's an overview of the general state of cybersecurity in the software market. We hear about breaches all the time, and we'll talk about those. But in general, is software secure? And maybe by sector, is it more secure or less secure? David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like a lot of us are still using legacy systems. There is still a really big skill gap and shortage in the market, especially when it comes to software development. And then the big thing I really think is speed versus security. We've gotten to this market where we need something new every year. Software has to come out, a new version has to come out every year. That actually, being on the software development side, is really hard to make sure that we are following the SDLC process, that we're making it secure by design and secure by default. And with us having to release so often and so regularly, a lot of the times, not with Splunk, but a lot of the times security gets dropped out. And I'm really worried about that. And I feel like using like the secure by design methodology and the SDLC process and like shipping left and software design is something we need to do. But right now I feel like there is a lot of gaps and vulnerabilities in the software out there. And it is something we definitely need to focus on and change, especially with like, SBOM, supply chain and things like that.
Is there any difference between, say, in general, the level of security quality between, say, software that is used as a service online versus software that the organization, the customer, would install on its own servers or in its cloud servers?
The big thing I see there is software itself, no, not more secure versus like an on-prem or cloud or SASE. However, the vulnerability management is where it comes in, where a SASE provider, they have to make sure it's patched, right? That's their livelihood. That is their reputation, to making sure they're secure and they're not being breached. So the vulnerability management, I think, is better at a SASE level, in the cloud level, versus on-prem. It is not reliant on a vendor or someone else patching it. It's reliant on yourself. You have to actually you have a good vulnerability management program in your patching. So that, I think, does play a role between the cloud and the on-prem instances.
Okay, and Kevin, we'll turn to you. Good to have you in studio with us here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I'm going to take a little bit different approach. It is something I talked about. I wrote an article maybe about 6 months ago talking about fixing the broken pieces, realizing software attestation, software liability. And I just want to get to a point where something you said, I don't think there's a such thing as secure software. And the reason why I say that is because all software has vulnerabilities or has CWEs that would eventually be vulnerabilities. So I don't think there's a such thing as a secure software. And I think sometimes that gives us this fallacy that we are building towards a desired state, which is secure software. And I don't think we have the right mindset because I don't think it's attainable. I think when you see something, as well, one of my good buddies, Brian Knapp would say, software gravity, where its features and complexity pulls towards systems over time, we create these vulnerabilities. And we're seeing more and more vulnerabilities because of the quality and lack of security in software. And a lot of that may be the result of poor software engineering practices that we don't see very much in a software development lifecycle process. And I wrote in the paper, I'm not sure SDLC actually works, right? We're seeing more and more bad software. So one of the things I would like to know is like, hey, we need to have a real good understanding of whether or not the things that we are told to do actually work, or in producing the intended outcomes that we desire. And that intended outcomes to me is improving the quality of software, improving the overall security of software, but also making software more resilient to these attacks that we're seeing. We're seeing a ton of attacks that are targeting software vulnerabilities and exploits, especially 0 days. We know threat actors are constantly looking for software exploits to launch ransomware attacks. So software is ubiquitous. It's in everything that we do. It's a part of all our daily lives, right? So whether we're going to cloud, wherever the case may be, software is pervasive. And if we're not improving software, I don't think we can really reduce the amount of cyber attacks that we see in industry.
Right. So it's almost like, say, cars. You can't make an accident-proof car because anything can crash, but it's still incumbent on the industry to keep working at it and keep improving it as time goes on.
Right. And I think part of it is like the things that we've been told to do around software. We need to make sure that they work. If they don't work, we need to create new ways of creating and building software. I always say we have to fail fast and try new things because we know the threat actors are always constantly trying new things. They're pushing the edge. I always say the threat actors are thinking and coloring outside the box, and we're still coloring inside the box, which speaks to our overall culture that we have in the United States around cyber. We're very, very risk averse, and I think a lot of times we have to try new things and be innovative and be somewhat forward-leaning in terms of how we design systems, but also ways in which we think about how adversaries are trying to target our critical systems and infrastructure.
So, David, that sounds like then it's incumbent on organizations to always have a risk management strategy in place. So at least if there are never going to be no vulnerabilities, you're aware of the top ones and at least can take care of the biggest risks first.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, Kevin, I agree with everything you said there as well, which kind of like, you're right. We can't actually build secure software. We can try our best. And that kind of leads into, what Cisla's initiative with Secure by Design. And I feel like that's something that we need to reapproach and rethink is when we are building software and we're building it, trying to be secure, it's not just about testing the code and make sure there's no known vulnerability. I think it's really about also going through and validating what logs I need out of that code so that I can find analysis. If there is a breach, I will be able to figure out what's going on. Also, how do I work, with the security remediation tools and the detection? How is that going to work with the API? If there is a breach, how am I going to work with security ecosystems to make sure that I can patch that quickly or that I can remediate it quickly? I think there's so much more to think about there. Another thing to think about is like adding field level access as well. So you're limiting that exposure or limiting those threats as much as possible. We can't completely prevent it, but we can try to really break apart and design it in a way that we have an ability to respond and the attackers have a much harder ability to exploit.
So Kevin, bridge that gap for us then. Software security is in some sense unobtainable, and yet we have to have secure by design software construction. So how does that all work?
I think it goes back to something that I always discuss, and I discussed in the article I wrote about software minimalism, in terms of building software with the essential things that we need, right? One of the great poets, Notorious B.I.G., he said, more money, more problems. Well, from the software world, more code means more complexity. More complexity means more problems, more vulnerabilities. So I do think we have a tendency to accumulate more and more software. The size of software is growing at a very, very huge rate. I think you have more software systems being larger, I think you increase the attack surface. And when you increase the attack surface, you increase the likelihood of a security breach. Because why? There's a 0-day lurking somewhere in these huge software systems, and complexity breeds more vulnerabilities. And then over time, we accumulate a lot of technical debt. And I think if we're not paying it down, what we're seeing in industry, like we see with C++, we having to pay down the technical debt has been associated with legacy systems. That's why the Secure by Design by CISA is well needed right now. And I applaud CISA for stepping up and really taking the leadership role and really trying to encourage, shift the mindset, as we've seen from the National Cybersecurity Strategy in terms of how we build software, and shifting the focus and the liability away from the consumer to the supplier. Because we have to build better software. There's no ifs, ands, questions about it. We have to build better software if we want to protect this nation.
Yeah, that idea of software minimalism is kind of appealing, when every time something gets updated, by where you work, that you had no say in, and then, what's going on here now? I liked it yesterday. I don't like it so much today. And David, you mentioned the idea of not just code testing, but also looking at log data and so forth, and validation procedures, which gets near and dear to Splunk's heart. Maybe just delve in a little bit to how that works in the development cycle, how you can make sure you build in that testability or discoverability of what might be flaws beyond code testing in that secure by design.
Yeah, it really comes down to when we are building software, bringing in practitioners and being like, hey, this is what the software is supposed to do. This is how it acts. This is how it's going to be working with other systems. What are things that you would like to know, you'd like to see? And then bringing that out into OCSF, which is the Open Cybersecurity Framework. So it's already in a structured way to make it even faster and more adaptable to other security tools and works with natively with everything in Splunk. The other thing to think about is compliance with the coding and the software development. And this has really come out with something called OTCAL, which is the Open Security Controls Assessment Language. And this really works to be able to test compliance in code to make sure that they are compliant with the controls. And we need to get more and more less and less paper-based control, more and more technical-based control. And all of that can go into a SAM, a log and you can correlate the data, like on being able to see in real time what's not compliant. What are the logs that are there? How do we find a root cause analysis to do that correlation to work with all the other security tools in the system?
Just a brief question, maybe you can both talk about, is the way software is deployed is changing in the sense that we no longer necessarily mount a piece of software as an application on a disk, and that's where it runs. We've gone to the virtualization era and now to the containerization era, where software is a bunch of millions of little modules that somehow come together logically for the purposes of presentation and use. Does that enhance security? Does it make it harder, or just substitute some problems for others?
I think it has some benefits, right? I think virtualization is good. I think using things like containers is good. It adds a layer of security. But I think part of it is it still goes back to design, right? The design becomes very important. How we deliver and ship software and deploy software, I think, has really increased our ability to get to market fast. And I applaud industry for taking on things like DevOps. I think that has been a game changer in terms of how we, support missions and support customers and things of that nature. But I think ultimately design becomes very important, because if you have a bad design over time, that design sometimes erodes, right? In terms of the design tactics that are in software, right, to protect like CIA, right, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Over time, those design concepts erode, and when they erode, they call flaws, right? And these flaws become exploited by threat actors, and we see that a lot of industry. So I do think some of the benefits with modern software development has been very beneficial in terms of how we build software and get to market to not only support the mission, but also support customers and whatever businesses that we have in terms of,
Right, getting to the customer base at hand that we're talking about today, and that is the federal agency. I mean, resiliency, the continuity of operations, disaster recovery, this is something they're very highly concerned about, as are all large organizations. What are some of the ways to remain resilient, to have continuity of operations, given how dangerous software breaches really are these days?
So for me, I think, in terms of building cyber resiliency, I think the key role or key part we have to do is we have to be able to anticipate, adapt, and evolve our cyber capabilities. And that really requires taking a threat-informed defense approach and really leveraging things like threat intelligence, understanding what our threat profile is so we can build the right protection mechanisms. I always say with zero trust, why build zero trust if you're not building the protection mechanisms that are going to protect you and be resilient against cyber threats? So being informed, and using threat intelligence, using that situation awareness to build the right zero trust capabilities, understanding how we mature zero trust over time based on doing a lot of things like red teaming, testing our security controls, testing protection mechanisms, become a very, very force multiplier in really building a robust and mature zero trust environment where we can be resilient, where we can anticipate, adapt, and also evolve our capabilities against threat actors. So I think that's important to have that mindset and really approach zero trust from a different perspective. I always say visibility is the most important thing, and elevating visibility is very important in disrupting threat actors' activities and behaviors.
Okay, and David, we recently saw a software. It wasn't really an attack. It was a mistake by a vendor across industry. And it turned out that some industries were way more resilient than others. And some major utility provider, let's say, of infrastructure, shut down for a whole day because of it. So maybe discuss resilience in the sense of mission criticality and how agencies can improve their resilience.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there is so much out there, and really just scaling back and understanding really what is the environment, what are the assets that you have, and what that attack surface is really important. And I agree with Kevin. Pen testing is probably underutilized. I feel like you don't know what you don't know. And so when you are doing continual pen testing, you can start finding what you don't know. And when you're in active zero trust and finding all of the different areas that you're supposed to be focusing on, deliberately, constantly pen testing each of those, and then as you compromise or as you're able to break through something, build an incident response plan, a true incident response plan. I've been a part of too many tabletop exercises, and it's like, I don't think this will ever really happen. And so when we're using pen testing, we're actually breaking into systems, we're actually impacting what's going on in a non-production way. Right? Then going back and saying, look, and how are we going to respond to this? What is that remediation effort? How long is it going to take? I remember in a lot of the tabletop exercises I've done, they're like, yeah, we're just going to take the backups and we're going to restore and we'll be backing up. I did one of those weeks to restore the data because there was so much data. You don't actually think about those things as you actually test it. So I feel like really testing, getting away from tabletop, real tests, more continuous and testing. And, like I said, I think Kevin said, he's bringing in that threat intel, bringing in that information. Information sharing is really key, and we need to get better at that for sure to help us be more resilient.
To David's point, I do think, this is how you codify and operationalize continuous monitoring, right? Where you're doing these things on a certain cadence to make sure that you can find gaps in your cyber defense, and then taking the right steps to improve that, elevate your cyber defense, because I think it's very important to do that. So we know from federal policies with FedRAMP, the new changes that come with FedRAMP, there needs to be a greater emphasis on continuous monitoring, because as we go through continuous ATO, you need to have the eyes, the assessments, the data, the artifacts to make informed decisions about risk. So I do think that becomes very important.
Right, and it strikes me that you can't really have zero trust unless you do that continuous monitoring and penetration testing on a regular schedule. Otherwise, how do you know whether you really have zero trust?
Well, threat actors are constantly shifting and changing their tradecraft. We see a lot of reconnaissance. There's a lot of data out there from breaches, right? All this data, wealth of data out there from breaches. So threat actors are constantly doing targeted attacks. They're constantly changing their tradecraft to launch their attacks. So if we're not constantly assessing where gaps are in our overall cyber defense, if we're not constantly testing whether or not certain threat actors can penetrate through our environment based off their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, I think we're not doing ourselves the service that we need to really protect the mission, but also improve how we build software systems and build that resiliency against known threat actors and cyber attacks.
David, thoughts on zero trust? How do you know whether you have it, or do you ever fully have it? And is it more of a process than a state?
So I think zero trust is something that we've been preaching for years. We've labeled it zero trust recently, but I've been talking about it in times. And I'm actually went back and thought about this. When I first started studying the big thing, it was layer 7 firewalls and instant identities and single sign-on and vulnerability management, EDR, MDR, DDR, SASE, AI response, quantum. Every year is a different thing. And how many of us can go back and say we implemented setting correctly? How many have we implemented vulnerability management, patch management? How many have we, actually implemented layer 7? And so you actually think about this, but moving quickly, you really need to scale back and relook at the systems that we have, consolidate the things we have, do a true assessment of zero trust and where we're at, and then slowly work and implement it correctly. I know we need to move fast. The faster we're moving, the more vulnerabilities we're bringing in, the less coverage we're bringing in. And I actually think about logging onto my system. I have a username, my password. I have multi-factor with my phone, and then I have a full application that is testing to make sure that the machine is meeting all of the requirements. That's actually pretty complex for me to get onto the system. But what's happening is I'm not vulnerable. I'm not the vulnerability. With vulnerability, it's gaps in the network, the actual infrastructure, the code itself. That's where customers are getting there, and the taxes are getting in with ransomware and with 0 days and things like that. It's not the user. And so going back to the basics and really working through and making sure they're implemented correctly, I think it's key to zero trust and making sure that we're doing it in the right way from the beginning to the end. It is a journey. It's not a destination. It's going to change. Now that we have AI, it's all changing again with security AI from AI in AI. So it will constantly adjusting as we go forward.
Well, one of the principles of zero trust is assume compromise. And if you look at all the attacks, right, no one ever sees the data leaving. So that's why I think visibility is one of the most important aspects of zero trust. And I think if you can get early warning signals around threat actor behaviors and activities, and also build that full spectrum of visibility where you have signals, where you understand threat actor behaviors. We know IOCs are way too late in the attack lifecycle. But just being able to have those early warning signals to be able to be somewhat on the front side of attacks, because no one ever sees the data leaving, and we're detecting attacks way too late in the attack lifecycle. And I think that's how we see a lot of these data breaches, because no one ever sees. We don't assume compromise. We want to.
You detect it.
Right. We got to be able to anticipate and adapt and evolve. And I think we don't do that to the best of our abilities. I think there's a lot of improvements for zero trust there.
And the notion of attestation came up earlier in the conversation. And one form of attestation is the software bill of materials, which would seem to go hand in hand with continuous monitoring and testing, because then you know what it is you've got in much more detail. Have you found that to be actually, in practical sense, something agencies are able to really use or leverage, the SBOM?
I think SBOM is one of those things. It's been around for a while, right? And I think we're starting to see a lot of agencies start to adopt it in some shape or form. If you go back to, I came in government in 2012, around that time, there was something called the Royce Bill. The Royce Bill had a lot of software bills of materials in it, right? It never made it to the floor. Now we see later, fast forward almost a decade later, now, SBOMs is somewhat mandatory, right? And agencies need to have some transparency in terms of the systems they acquire from integrators, right? What are the components and libraries that are part of building your system? Because that becomes very important. I always say the more software you borrow in terms of open source software, the more risks you take on, knowingly, unknowingly, right? So having some idea of what CVEs are lurking in your software, what CWEs also are potentially there that can expose vulnerabilities becomes very important. So SBOMs gives you a way to formalize that, but it also gives you the awareness that you need to make informed decisions about risk for software.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the response. You can't trust anything that's coming from software. So you definitely have to work with the companies, because picking companies that you trust, that they do security testing and validation of their supply chain. And then being able to work with you and saying, hey, I don't trust you. I need to make sure that I'm also getting metrics and information from you so that I'm staying protected. And I think that is something that we definitely need to work on as an industry, is more collaboration with that as well. Because we don't know what that's not supply chain and what keeps on going down the line.
And, we've seen some pretty spectacular breaches, cybersecurity events that were not breaches, as we mentioned earlier, but simply, bad updates with flaws in them. We've seen airlines and healthcare organizations and networks of car repair shops, of all things, really come to an almost standstill and have to go back to paper in some cases. Are we learning enough from these? Are there lessons learned you think the industry is inculcating from these events such that we can maybe prevent the next one?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what we've learned over the years around these breaches, because we keep seeing them, right? We don't see a major shift in terms of how we think about cyber, and I think that's part of the problem. And I think we've created a culture where we're constantly painting and coloring inside the boxes I mentioned earlier, and we're not trying new things. We're not failing fast, and I think that becomes part of a risk-averse culture. And in doing so, I do think that we're not making the right shifts that we need to keep pace with threat actors. So when you start talking about these breaches and some of the things that we see, it's almost like the adversary has a playbook and we're not adjusting. We're not making the fourth quarter or halftime adjustments to at least disrupt threat actor activity and behavior. So I do think there's a ton of wealth of information. That's why MITRE ATT&CK started MITRE ATT&CK. There's a ton of curated threat intelligence that talks about how threat actors are trying to attack us, right? We can learn from that. We can curate that. We can codify that into our daily operations and learn from that and build playbooks and leverage, as David indicated, SOAR, right? To use that to hunt for things that are known and associated with threat actors. So I do think there are things that we can learn, but by and large, I don't think we've built the right culture, the right appetite for cyber.
We are very retroactive. We say we're proactive by having automated detections, automated response, but that's still retroactive. That's after the breach. We need to spend more time on the front. We actually now have an attack analyzer, which as you're bringing in any files or anything coming in, detonates everything and saying if it's good before it ever reaches a system. And we need to get anything coming in needs to be analyzed wholly, and anything going out needs to be decrypted and verified as it's going out. If you can stop the whole start of the chain access to the system and anything leaving the system, validating that is where we really need. We're still 100%. All of the things is equal. It's detecting what's already happened, not really preventing anything that could happen.
And we have to keep our people trained too, because the phishing is such a popular vector for so many hackers.
Yeah, phishing is a popular vector, but we're starting to see, as has been cited in a lot of threat intelligence reports, these trend reports that we see, threat actors are starting to use more 0 days and software exploits to launch ransomware attacks. And I think that creates a very interesting battlefield for us, because obviously social engineering is still a major part, because they always say humans are the weakest link in the equation, but now software becomes a equally weak link. So we have our work cut out for us in terms of how we're going to protect this nation, how we're going to elevate our cyber defense. But to me, I think it all starts with understanding how to build better software, looking at whether or not the things that we've been told in terms of how we build software actually work. And if they don't work, we need to try new things. And I think if we try new things, I think we fail fast and move forward and create a healthier software world.
All right. On that note, I want to thank today's guests. Kevin Green is the Public Sector Chief Technology Officer at OpenText, and David Dalling is the Vice President of Cyber Strategy at Splunk. And I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.